The lights were blinding. The stage, too big, and in the center of it all stood a 6-year-old boy, motionless. Michael Jackson. His tiny hands clutched the microphone. His brothers waited for the cue, instruments poised, hearts racing. But Michael couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't sing. The music had stopped before it even began. The audience, hundreds of parents, neighbors, and strangers, began to murmur. Whispers filled the hall. The spotlight felt like fire against his skin. His chest tightened. He wanted to disappear. For the first time in his young life, the boy who would one day move millions couldn't move at all. His brothers shifted nervously. Joe Jackson, standing near the side of the stage, clenched his fists, jaw tight. He had worked too hard for this moment. His boys were supposed to prove something tonight, that the Jackson family wasn't ordinary, that they had something special. But now, as seconds turned to eternity, that dream was slipping away. And then, in the middle of the chaos, fear, and silence, one person made a move. Not his father, not his brothers. His mother, Katherine Jackson, sitting quietly among the crowd, looked up at her frozen son. Her face didn't show panic or disappointment. Instead, she smiled. A gentle, calm smile, one only a mother could give. She didn't shout. She didn't wave her arms. She just mouthed 3 silent words. "You can do it. 10 seconds. That's all it took. Something changed in Michael's eyes. The fear didn't vanish completely, but it cracked. Enough for courage to slip through. He took a breath, deep and trembling, and then he sang. That night, something was born. Something the world would one day call magic. But what happened in those few seconds, what his mother did, and how that moment reshaped everything, was not just the start of a performance. It was the beginning of a destiny that would change the sound of music forever. Because before there was the king of pop, there was a terrified little boy on a small stage in Gary, Indiana, and a mother's unshakable faith that became the foundation of a legend. But how did they even get there? How does a shy, barefoot child from a poor family end up standing in that blinding spotlight? And why did that single, silent moment mean everything? To understand that, we need to go back, before the fame, before the moonwalk, before the world even knew his name. There was just Gary, Indiana, a steel town, cold, rough, full of noise and smoke, rows of small houses pressed together, streets filled with the sounds of labor and survival. The Jackson home was tiny, 2 bedrooms for 9 children. But inside, it pulsed with something the world outside didn't have. Rhythm. Everywhere you turned, there was sound. Joe Jackson strumming his guitar after work, the radio humming Motown melodies, children tapping spoons, drumming on furniture, laughing, arguing, singing. For the Jacksons, music wasn't a hobby. It was a heartbeat. But life was hard. Joe worked long hours at the steel mill. Katherine sewed clothes to make ends meet. Every dollar mattered. Every dream was expensive. And yet, somehow, in that cramped house, hope lived. Katherine was the quiet center of it all. Gentle, deeply spiritual, always humming hymns under her breath. Her voice carried peace. Her presence carried belief. Michael, her 8th child, was different from the start. Curious eyes, soft-spoken, always watching. He would sit near the record player for hours, absorbing every note, every lyric, every rhythm. But he was also shy, painfully shy. He loved to sing when no one was watching. He'd hum along to Sam Cooke and Jackie Wilson, but if someone looked at him, he'd stop. Still, Katherine noticed. She saw the spark before anyone else did. The way he felt the music, not just heard it. The way he moved without thinking, like rhythm lived inside him. She told Joe, "You should hear Michael sing. He's special." Joe frowned at first, the kind of man who didn't show excitement easily. But he listened, and what he heard changed everything. That night he told the boys, Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, "We're gonna make a group. We're gonna be the Jackson Brothers." Michael wasn't even supposed to be part of it. He was too young, too small. But something would soon happen that no one could ignore. Because when that little boy opened his mouth to sing, Even his father went silent. The Jackson home would never sound the same again. But before that moment arrived, there was still innocence, laughter, childhood, and a mother's quiet dream that maybe, just maybe, their family's love for music could lift them out of Gary. She had no idea how high it would lift them, or how much it would cost, because dreams, as she would soon learn, demand everything. It began in the living room. The furniture pushed aside, a single light bulb swinging overhead. The Jackson brothers lined up with homemade instruments, a guitar with missing strings, an old tambourine, makeshift drums. Joe Jackson stood in front of them, arms crossed. "All right," he said. "Let's see what you got." Tito strummed. Jermaine sang backup. Jackie tried to stay in rhythm. It was rough, unpolished, but there was energy. Michael stood at the edge, watching, barefoot, silent, too small to be taken seriously. Joe barked, "Sing, Michael." Michael hesitated. The brothers looked at him, half amused, half curious. "Come on, little man," Jackie teased. "Show us what you got." The boy looked down at his hands. His heart raced. He didn't want to disappoint them, especially his mother watching quietly from the kitchen doorway. So he opened his mouth, and the room changed. The tiny voice that came out wasn't tiny at all. It was raw, soulful, filled with something no 6-year-old should be able to express. Joe froze. Tito stopped playing. Jermaine looked at Michael like he was seeing him for the first time. Even the air seemed to pause. It wasn't just talent, it was truth. Every note, every sound came straight from the heart. When he finished, there was silence. Then Joe spoke quietly. "Do that again." Michael did, this time with more confidence, more soul. Joe's eyes gleamed. "We're adding you to the group." From that night, the rehearsals changed. Every evening after Joe came home from the mill, the brothers practiced for hours. No mistakes, no excuses. If a note was wrong, they started over. If a step was missed, they started again. Joe demanded perfection, because in his mind, perfection was the only way out. But while his father pushed them, it was his mother who guided Michael through it. When his voice cracked, she said, "It's okay. Keep going." When he cried from exhaustion, she whispered, "God gave you this gift. Don't be afraid of it." Catherine's belief became Michael's secret fuel. And soon, that living room couldn't contain what they had become. Neighbors gathered outside to listen through the windows. People started talking. "Those Jackson boys can sing." One day, Joe said the words that made Michael's stomach twist in both excitement and fear. "We're performing at the school talent show." The brothers cheered. Michael didn't, because singing in the living room was one thing. Singing in front of strangers? Under the lights? With everyone watching? That was something else entirely. Catherine noticed his silence. That night, as she tucked him into bed, she said softly, "Michael, don't be afraid of people looking at you. They're not there to judge you. They just want to feel what you feel when you sing." He nodded, but her words couldn't stop the fear forming in his chest. He wanted to make her proud. He wanted to make his father proud. But the thought of standing in front of a crowd made his hands tremble. Still, the day came. The stage was set. The brothers ready, and Michael was terrified. He tried to smile, to be brave. But as the lights went up and the crowd quieted, his throat closed. The music started, and that's where it all froze. A silence that would echo through history. Because what happened next, in just 10 seconds, would not only change a boy's life, but define the sound of a generation. And it all began with one mother's silent faith. The closer the talent show came, the quieter Michael became. Every night, while his brothers laughed and practiced dance moves in the living room, Michael sat in the corner, hands folded, eyes distant. He loved the songs, he loved the rhythm, but he couldn't stop picturing the stage. The crowd staring at him, waiting for him to sing, waiting for him not to fail. Joe noticed his silence but didn't see the fear behind it. To him, it looked like laziness. "You want to be great, don't you?" he'd say. "Then you better act like it." Michael would nod, not because he agreed, but because he didn't dare argue. Joe's voice was steel, Catherine's was silk. Between them, Michael lived in the space of both, the pressure to be perfect, and the promise that love could hold him together. The brothers practiced until their feet ached. Jermaine reminded him, "You're the best one, little man. Don't mess it up," Tito laughed. "He's too good to mess up." But Michael didn't laugh back. At night, lying in bed, he'd whisper to himself, "What if I forget the words? What if they laugh? What if I can't move?" Catherine would find him awake long past bedtime. She'd sit on the edge of his bed, her hand gentle on his forehead. "You don't have to be perfect, baby. Just sing from your heart." He'd nod, pretending to believe her. But the truth was, he didn't trust his heart. It beat too fast, too hard. The night before the show, the house was filled with nervous energy. Costumes were laid out. Matching shirts, shiny shoes polished to mirror brightness. Joe rehearsed every detail again and again. The brothers complained but obeyed. And Michael? He stared at his reflection in the window. He saw a boy who wanted to make his family proud, but also a boy who wasn't sure he belonged on that stage. At one point, he whispered, "Mom, what if I can't do it?" Catherine knelt beside him. "Then don't force it. Just remember who you are. You're Michael. And when you sing, the world stops to listen." She smiled, kissed his forehead, and left the room. But those words stayed with him. The world stops to listen. He didn't understand how true that would one day be. The next morning, Michael woke up before the sun. He couldn't eat. His brothers teased him, but it didn't help. His hands shook as he buttoned his shirt. Joe's voice boomed through the house. "Let's go!" As they piled into the car, Michael pressed his face against the window, watching Gary pass by. The old houses, the people walking to work, the cold gray streets. For a moment he wondered if they knew who he was. Probably not. But deep inside, something whispered that after tonight, they would. Still, that whisper was drowned out by the pounding of his heart. He wasn't ready. He was sure of it. And as the car pulled up to the small auditorium, and the sound of chatter and laughter filled the air, Michael's hands went cold. The fear was no longer in his head. It was in his body. In his breath, in his heartbeat, in his very bones. When Joe turned around and said, "You boys ready?" Michael didn't answer, because he wasn't. He didn't know that fear, in a few hours, would become the doorway to destiny. He didn't know that silence could turn into music. He didn't know that his mother's faith, quiet, invisible, powerful, was about to pull him across that threshold. The auditorium was alive with sound, laughter, clapping, chairs scraping the floor. Families crowded the rows, proud parents ready to cheer for their children. Backstage, the Jackson brothers waited for their turn. The smell of dust, wood, and sweat hung heavy in the air. Tito tapped his foot nervously. Jermaine tuned his guitar. Jackie kept peeking through the curtain to watch other acts. Kids dancing, a girl reciting a poem, a boy playing trumpet. Michael stood apart. His costume, a little too big, made him feel small. His brothers whispered encouragements, but he barely heard them. The lights from the stage spilled through the curtain, bright and blinding. Every sound from the crowd felt magnified. Every cheer for another performer made his stomach twist tighter. Finally, someone called out, "Next up, the Jackson brothers." Applause followed. The boys looked at each other, wide-eyed. It was time. They stepped out together. Michael followed last, his feet feeling like they weren't his own. The audience cheered, polite, curious. Jermaine counted them in. The first notes began. Then, silence. Michael froze. His voice wouldn't come. His body wouldn't move. His brothers turned toward him, confused. The music stumbled, faltered. The audience waited. Seconds passed. Long, unbearable seconds. Joe's expression from the side of the stage darkened, every muscle in his face tense. This was not how it was supposed to go. But Michael couldn't help it. He was trapped inside his own mind. The lights were too hot. The faces in the crowd blurred. His heart pounded so loud it drowned out everything else. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. Whispers rippled through the room. The brothers tried again, starting the song over. Still, Michael didn't move. And then, something caught his eye. In the front row, among the shadows and faces, one person wasn't whispering, wasn't frowning. Katherine Jackson. She sat still, calm, her eyes locked on her son. While others shifted in their seats, she didn't move. She simply smiled, a soft, knowing smile. In that moment, the noise disappeared. The crowd, the lights, the fear, gone. It was just Michael and his mother. She didn't need to speak. Her eyes said everything. "You can do it." 3 silent words. Michael's breath caught. The tears he didn't even know he'd been holding back stopped. He remembered what she said the night before. "Just sing from your heart." And suddenly, he did. A small voice, shaky at first, slipped into the microphone. A note, then another, stronger, clearer. The crowd leaned forward. The brothers looked up in relief. By the second verse, Michael wasn't singing anymore. He was soaring. The fear transformed into energy, and the energy became power. The same lights that had blinded him now felt like sunlight. The same crowd that had terrified him now felt like home. Every step, every sound, every note carried a force that none of them, not even Joe, had ever seen before. By the time the song ended, the audience was on its feet. Applause thundered through the room. People shouted his name. Michael stood there, stunned. The fear was gone, replaced by something else. Something alive, electric, unstoppable. He smiled. Not for the audience, but for one person only. Katherine smiled back, eyes glistening. In 10 seconds, she had changed everything. That moment wasn't just a victory. It was the birth of something extraordinary. The boy who froze on stage would never freeze again. That night, the Jackson brothers became the Jackson 5. But more importantly that night, Michael Jackson found the part of himself that would never leave him. The connection between music, courage, and love. After the show, backstage, everyone talked at once. Joe was beaming with pride, pretending he wasn't. The brothers hugged each other, laughing. Michael sat in the corner, quiet again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't fear, it was peace. Katherine walked in. The noise fell away for him. She knelt beside him and whispered, "See, you did it." Michael looked up and said softly, "I saw you." She smiled. "I know." That's all they needed to say. Because both of them knew something had shifted forever. A door had opened, and there was no closing it now. The little boy who couldn't face the crowd had become the center of it. The fear that once paralyzed him had turned into fire. And yet, neither of them understood how much that fire would demand from him in the years to come. Tonight was a triumph, but it was also the beginning of a path that would burn brighter and harder than anyone could imagine, because greatness never comes without sacrifice, and the same stage that gave him wings would one day take his childhood. But for now, for this night, all that mattered was a mother's faith, a boy's courage, and 10 seconds that rewrote music history, 10 seconds that turned silence into song, 10 seconds that created Michael Jackson. And the world had no idea what was coming. Next, applause still thundered in Michael's ears, but he could barely process it. He stood frozen again, not from fear this time, but from awe. Something had shifted inside him. Just moments earlier, he had been trapped in silence, drowning in the weight of the crowd. And then a single look from his mother, calm, patient, loving, broke through the noise of his panic. That look was more than encouragement. It was belief. And belief, when passed from a mother to her child, can move mountains. Michael didn't understand it then, but that moment would stay with him for the rest of his life. It would become the heartbeat behind every performance, every note, every song he'd ever sing. When he took that breath and let his voice out, it wasn't practice or talent or training that saved him. It was connection. A connection so pure it bypassed thought and fear. The crowd hadn't just seen a performance. They had witnessed transformation. By the time the brothers hit their final note, the energy in that little gymnasium was electric. It wasn't just applause, it was recognition. Something rare had just happened, something that made everyone forget where they were. Michael stood there breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling, eyes scanning the audience until they found her again. His mother, hands clasped, eyes shining. For a moment, they just looked at each other. No words, just love and relief, the kind only two people could share who had walked through fear together. But behind the curtain, another pair of eyes was watching. Sharp, assessing, already planning. Joe Jackson. He saw what everyone else saw, but differently. While the crowd saw a miracle, Joe saw potential. Raw, powerful, unshaped potential that could take them beyond Gary, beyond the steel mill, beyond struggle itself. And in that instant, the idea of the Jackson brothers stopped being a hobby. It became a mission. Michael, of course, knew nothing of that. He was just a boy, dizzy with joy, still feeling the echo of music inside his chest. His brothers surrounded him, slapping his back, laughing. Jermaine said, "Man, you killed it." Jackie added, "You froze it first, but then, whoa!" The crowd went crazy. Even Tito, usually quiet, grinned. "You made the whole show, Mike." But Michael didn't say much. He just smiled shyly, still replaying those 10 seconds in his head. The silence, his mother's smile, his voice breaking through. 10 seconds. That's all it took to turn fear into magic. Years later, when interviewers would ask him about his first performance, he'd always talk about that moment. The fear, the silence, and his mother's face in the crowd. He'd say, "My mother, she believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Because that's what changed music that night. Not a note, not a dance step, not a song. It was belief, Catherine. Jackson's belief that love could steady trembling hands and give courage to a frightened boy. That moment didn't just awaken a voice. It set a destiny in motion. Without those 10 seconds, there might never have been Thriller, no Billie Jean, no moonwalk that stopped the world, because before there was mastery, there was faith. Before there was legend, there was love. As the night ended and the family drove home, Joe talked about plans. "We're going to rehearse harder now," he said. "You boys have something special." The brothers nodded, still riding the thrill, but Michael sat quietly, staring out the window. The city lights blurred past, reflections flickering in his eyes. He wasn't thinking about fame. He wasn't thinking about future concerts or record deals. He was thinking about the stage, how terrifying it was, and how alive it made him feel. He whispered to himself, almost inaudible, "I want to do that again." And he would, over and over, for the rest of his life. He didn't know it yet, but he'd just taken his first step into something far bigger than himself. A 6-year-old's 10 seconds of courage had just ignited a fire that would burn for decades. Through applause, through pain, through history, but as with every fire, someone has to feed it, and no one was more determined to feed that flame than Joe Jackson, because while Catherine saw her son's gift as a blessing, Joe saw it as a mission. And missions, in his world, demanded discipline, control, and sacrifice. That quiet moment of mother and son on stage, pure, emotional, unplanned, would soon collide with something much harsher. The stage had given Michael power. Now, it was going to take everything from him. The Jackson home buzzed with excitement that night. The boys talked non-stop, replaying every second of their performance. The neighbors who had attended the talent show called to congratulate them. Some even dropped by, bringing leftover cake, shaking Joe's hand, telling him, "You've got stars in your house." For the first time, the little home on Jackson Street felt like it was filled with light. Joe sat at the kitchen table, a rare smile breaking through his usual stern expression. "That was something," he said, trying not to sound too impressed. "That crowd loved you." Jermaine grinned. "They loved Michael. He's the reason we won." Everyone turned to look at the youngest brother. Michael blushed, looking down. "We all did good," he said softly. But Joe shook his head. "No, they saw something in you, boy. You're different." Those words, "you're different," landed heavy in the room. No one quite knew what they meant, but Michael felt a strange mix of pride and pressure. Later that night, after the excitement faded and everyone went to bed, Catherine found Michael awake again. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, humming quietly to himself. "You should be sleeping, baby," she said. "I can't," he whispered. "I keep hearing the clapping." Catherine smiled. "You did something special tonight." Michael looked up at her. "I thought I was going to mess up, Mom." "I know," she said softly. "But you didn't. You were brave." He paused. "Did you know I was scared?" She nodded. "I could see it from the moment you walked on that stage. But I also knew you'd find your way." Michael leaned against her. "I saw you in the crowd." "I know you did," she said, her hand resting on his hair. "And when you did, I knew you'd be okay." There was silence between them for a while. The kind of silence that holds peace, not fear. Then Catherine said something that would stay with him for life. "Whenever you sing, remember, you're never alone. Even if I'm not there, I'm with you. Always." Michael closed his eyes and whispered, "I'll remember." That promise became part of him. It would echo decades later, in stadiums filled with thousands, in moments of exhaustion, in loneliness on tour buses. Her words, her faith, her belief. Down the hall, Joe lay awake too. But his thoughts were not of tenderness. They were of opportunity. He couldn't stop replaying the scene. The applause, the cheers, the look on people's faces when Michael sang. He saw not just talent, but potential profit. Gary, Indiana, was not meant to be forever. The mills, the dust, the endless struggle. Joe wanted out, and now he believed he had found the way. The next morning before breakfast, Joe called the boys to the living room. "We're rehearsing again tonight," he said. Tito groaned. "But we just performed." Joe's tone hardened. "That was one show. We're not stopping now. If you think one applause means you've made it, you're wrong." Michael looked at his mother. She didn't say a word, but her eyes said everything. Be patient. Stay kind. Stay true. The brothers agreed, reluctantly. That night, the same living room that had been filled with laughter now echoed with footsteps, claps, and Joe's sharp commands. Every mistake was corrected. Every misstep restarted. Every voice had to hit the note perfectly. It was tough, unforgiving. But underneath the fatigue, Michael felt something else: hunger. Every time he sang, he felt closer to that moment from the talent show. The moment when fear vanished, when everything made sense, and so he endured. While his brothers grew tired, he grew sharper. While others saw practice as punishment, he saw it as a way to return to that feeling. The feeling of connection, of magic. It became his secret fuel. Days turned into weeks. The Jackson brothers began to sound different. Tighter, stronger, polished. Neighbors would gather again outside their windows just to listen. Soon they were invited to perform at local clubs, then small competitions, then even beyond Gary. Every time they performed, Michael stepped on stage remembering one thing: his mother's eyes in the crowd. He didn't need her to be there physically anymore. That image lived inside him, pushing him, grounding him. But as his star began to rise, so did the expectations. Joe's dream was becoming reality. But Catherine's gentle boy, the one who once froze on stage, was slowly learning that success came at a cost. He was learning what it meant to give everything. Not just time, but childhood, innocence, peace. Still he sang. Still he smiled. Still he believed, because the memory of that night, the applause, the courage, the love, was more than enough to keep him going. But deep down, something else was forming. The first shadow of what it meant to live for the stage. Michael didn't know it yet, but every triumph would carry a weight. Every cheer would echo with the same silence he had once felt before he sang. And that silence, that moment before the music, would follow him forever, because that's where his story began, and where it would one day end. Joe Jackson stood in the dim light of the living room, hands on his hips, eyes on his sons as they rehearsed. The air was thick with rhythm, the slap of shoes on wooden floors, the sharp snaps of fingers, the smooth blend of 5 young voices learning to move as one. But Joe wasn't just listening to music. He was hearing escape. Every beat, every harmony, every perfect turn of Michael's voice. It all sounded like a door opening out of Gary, Indiana, out of the noise of factory shifts and unpaid bills. He saw it so clearly it almost frightened him. His sons could be more than local talent show winners. They could be famous. And Michael was the key. At first it started with ambition, but soon ambition turned into obsession. The rehearsals grew longer. Mistakes weren't tolerated. If a note was missed, Joe stopped everything. "Again!" he'd shout. "Do it right this time!" There were nights when the boys' voices cracked from exhaustion, when little fingers bled from guitar strings, when even laughter disappeared from the house. But Joe told himself it was worth it. He wasn't being cruel. He was building greatness. Catherine would sometimes step in, gently placing a hand on Joe's shoulder. "They're just kids," she'd say. And Joe would respond, almost in a whisper. Not for long. He believed the world didn't care about weakness. He'd seen it chew up men and spit them out. He wasn't about to let his family suffer that same fate. But Michael was different. The little boy who had once been too scared to sing now seemed to come alive every time the music started. He had an instinct no one could explain. He could feel where the song wanted to go before anyone else did. Joe noticed it too. He noticed everything. The way Michael hit a note and made people stop talking. The way his brothers unconsciously followed his rhythm. The way his eyes lit up on stage. That spark. It was rare. Joe didn't understand it, but he knew one thing. If he didn't push, the world might never see it. And so, he pushed harder. One night, after a particularly grueling rehearsal, Michael sat on the porch steps, staring at the moon. His brothers had gone to bed. He hummed softly to himself, a melody forming in his mind that didn't belong to any of their songs. Catherine came out quietly. "You're still up?" "I can't sleep," Michael said. "The music won't stop in my head." She smiled. "That's a gift, Michael." He looked at her, his eyes full of innocence and confusion. "But sometimes it feels like it won't let me rest." Catherine sat beside him. "That's what gifts do, baby. They ask a lot from you, but you can't let them take everything." Michael nodded, though he didn't quite understand. Behind them, the front door creaked open. Joe stepped out, overhearing the last line. "It's not taking," he said firmly. "It's giving. You want something in life? You give everything." He looked at his son, his tone softening slightly. "You did good tonight, Michael. Real good." Michael smiled faintly, unsure whether to feel proud or tired. That night Joe went back inside and sat by the radio, tuning through stations. He wasn't looking for music. He was listening for opportunity. Somewhere between static and soul, he found it. A local talent agent was hosting auditions for young bands in Chicago. Joe's eyes narrowed. His mind was already made up. That night he didn't sleep either. He just sat there, planning. In his head the path was already drawn, from Chicago to Motown to the world. He saw it all unfolding, like destiny in motion. But destiny, as he would soon learn, demands a price. And in the middle of it all stood a little boy who just wanted to sing. Not for fame, not for money, but for the feeling it gave him. Joe saw success. Michael saw music. And that difference would change everything. The line between love and control was starting to blur. And before long, it would disappear completely. Chicago. The big city lights. The echo of traffic. the hum of something larger than life. When the Jackson brothers arrived for the audition, Michael's heart raced the same way it had at that first school performance. Crowds, judges, microphones. It was happening again. The same pressure, the same fear. But this time there was no small gymnasium, no familiar faces, just strangers waiting to be impressed. Joe gathered his sons before they went on. "Remember what I told you," he said. "No mistakes, no second chances. You go out there and show them who you are." Michael nodded. His hands were trembling, but when he looked to the side, he saw his mother's gentle smile. Calm, quiet, reassuring. And just like before, that fear began to fade. When the music started, Michael's voice cut through the noise of the city. It wasn't the voice of a child. It was something far older, wiser, filled with emotion that seemed too deep for his age. By the time they finished, the judges sat in stunned silence. Then came applause. Long, loud, unstoppable. They didn't just win the audition. They were invited to perform again. The door had opened, and behind that door waited a life Michael could never have imagined. Recording studios, spotlights, crowds chanting his name. But for every cheer, there was a cost. The schedule tightened. Rehearsals turned into routines. Routines turned into rituals. Joe watched over everything. Every step, every note, every breath. Michael learned quickly that there was no room for mistakes. Once, when he missed a beat during practice, Joe stopped the music. The silence that followed was louder than any sound. "Do it again," Joe said, his voice cold. Michael swallowed hard, nodded, and sang again. Perfectly this time. The praise never came, but the silence meant approval, and that was enough. As the months passed, Michael grew used to the rhythm of discipline. But sometimes, late at night, he'd wake up to the sound of music still playing in his head. He'd sit by the window looking out into the darkness, whispering melodies to himself. The world saw talent. His father saw perfection, but inside, Michael was just trying to find peace. One evening after another long day of rehearsal, he sat in the quiet corner of their small Chicago motel. Catherine found him tracing circles on a napkin, humming softly. "What are you thinking about, baby?" she asked. Michael looked up, hesitant. "Sometimes I feel like I don't get to be me." Her heart ached. "What do you mean?" He paused, searching for the right words. "When I sing, I feel free. But when the music stops, I don't know who I am." Catherine's eyes glistened. She reached for his hand. "Then sing, Michael, whenever you can. Because that's the part of you no one can take." Those words sank deep into his heart. He didn't know it, but they'd become his lifeline. Through the chaos of fame, through the loneliness of success, through the pressure that would one day nearly break him. For now, though, he was still a boy with a dream, and a father determined to make that dream real, no matter the cost. Back home in Gary, Joe gathered the family. He stood in front of them, holding a flyer in his hand. "Motown's having open auditions," he said, eyes gleaming. "This is it. This is the big one." The boys stared, wide-eyed. Even Catherine looked uneasy. "Joe, they're just kids," she said again. He turned to her, firm but calm. "They won't be kids forever. We've got one shot, and I'm not letting it slip away." That night the house filled again with sound, rehearsing, repeating, refining. Michael's voice carried through the walls, clear and haunting. It wasn't just practice anymore. It was history beginning to form. Outside, the neighbors paused to listen, shaking their heads in wonder. Inside, a father pushed, a mother prayed, and a boy sang his heart out, unaware that every note was carving a path that would one day lead him to the top of the world. But even as his voice grew stronger, so did the pressure. The applause was becoming addictive, the perfection expected. And somewhere deep down, a question began to whisper inside him. A question that would follow him for decades. Will they still love me if I stop? He didn't know the answer. He just knew he couldn't stop now. Because somewhere inside him, That 6-year-old boy who once froze on stage was still chasing the feeling of that night. The moment his mother's belief turned fear into music. That was the spark that started it all. And it was still burning, brighter, fiercer, and more dangerous than ever. As Joe prepared to take the family to Motown, Michael felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. He looked out the window one last time at the quiet street he grew up on. In his heart, he could hear the echo of that first crowd, the warmth of his mother's smile, and the sound of his own voice breaking through fear. He didn't know it yet. But that boy from Gary was about to become the voice of a generation. And the world, the entire world, was about to hear him. But for now, in that small house, with the stars just beginning to fade outside his window, Michael whispered softly to himself, "Don't be scared this time." And for the second time in his young life, he wasn't. The drive to Detroit felt endless. The Jackson family van was filled with tension and dreams. No one spoke much, but everyone knew what was at stake. Joe had rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times. He'd planned every note, every harmony, every move. But beneath his confidence, even he was afraid. This wasn't just another local performance. This was Motown, the label that had given the world Smokey Robinson, the Supremes, Stevie Wonder, legends born from nothing but talent and heart. And now, his boys were walking into the same building. When they arrived at Motown's headquarters, it didn't look like much from the outside, just another brick building in Detroit. But inside, it was magic. The air buzzed with possibility, with music that would define an era. The brothers waited in a small hallway, clutching their instruments. The sound of laughter and instruments tuning drifted through the thin walls. Michael sat quietly, hands folded, eyes wide. He wasn't scared this time, but he was nervous. The kind of nervous that comes when you know something big is about to happen and you don't want to lose it. Joe paced the room like a lion in a cage. "Remember the routine," he said. "Tight, no mistakes. They're looking for stars." When their names were called, the boys stepped into the audition room. The space was plain. Just a few chairs, a microphone, a piano in the corner. Behind a desk sat a group of men and women, one of them Berry Gordy himself, the man who had built Motown with his own hands. He looked at the group of boys, barely teenagers, their youngest no taller than the microphone stand. He raised an eyebrow. "You all the Jackson brothers?" Joe spoke up. "The Jackson 5, sir." Gordy smiled faintly. "All right then. Show me what you got." Jermaine strummed the first chord on his guitar. Tito joined in. Jackie and Marlon began to harmonize. And then Michael stepped forward. From the very first note, the room changed. His voice was clear, full of emotion that no 6-year-old should have been able to feel. He didn't just sing the song, he lived it. Every line, every note carried a story. His small frame seemed to channel something far bigger, something ancient and powerful. The executives leaned forward, their smiles fading into stunned silence. Even Berry Gordy's usually calm expression broke into disbelief. By the time the song ended, there was no question left to ask. Gordy stood up slowly, clapping his hands. "That," he said, "was something special." Joe's chest swelled with pride, but Michael wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about the music still echoing inside him. "Where'd you learn to sing like that, son?" Gordy asked. Michael shrugged shyly. "From my mom." The room laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so honest. In that instant, Gordy saw it. The rarest thing in music, truth. A child who didn't just perform for fame, but because he had to. He turned to Joe. "I want to see them again. Soon. They've got something we can't teach." When the family left the building, Joe tried to keep his composure, but Catherine saw the way his hands trembled slightly. He knew. They all knew. Something had just begun that could never be undone. That night back at the motel, the boys were too excited to sleep. They replayed every second of the audition, laughing, singing, arguing over who hit the best note. Michael sat quietly on the edge of his bed, humming the song again under his breath. Catherine came in, her presence soft as always. "You did beautifully today." He looked up. "Do you think they'll call us back?" She smiled. "I think they'd be fools not to." But Michael wasn't thinking about record deals or fame. He was thinking about how it felt. That moment on stage when everything else disappeared except the music. That was his home. And even though he didn't know it yet, that feeling, that need to keep chasing the magic, would guide him for the rest of his life. Somewhere in Detroit, Barry Gordy sat alone in his office, listening to the recording they'd made of the Jacksons' audition. When Michael's voice filled the room again, Gordy leaned back, shook his head and whispered, "He's got it. The kind of magic that only comes once in a generation." And in that moment, the wheels of history began to turn. But as one dream was being born, another part of childhood quietly slipped away. The spotlight, once thrilling, would soon become a cage. Weeks later, the Jackson family got the call. Motown wanted them. Joe hung up the phone and turned to his sons, his face unreadable for a long moment, until a rare smile broke through. "Pack your things," he said. "We're going to be stars." The house erupted in cheers. Michael laughed, spinning around the living room, his excitement bursting out of him like sunlight. Catherine watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with pride and worry. She knew what fame could do. She knew the cost of a dream when the dream was bigger than the dreamer, but she said nothing. She just hugged her son a little tighter that night. Soon the family was in the Motown studio. Bright lights, polished floors, engineers moving like clockwork. It was a different world. Michael walked in, his eyes wide with wonder. Everything felt magical. The microphones, the instruments, the voices echoing through the rooms. He recorded his first lines with trembling hands, but when the music started, something shifted. The shyness vanished. The boy who once froze on stage now commanded every note, every breath. The producers stood silent, watching in awe. "He's not just good," one whispered. "He's unreal." Days turned into weeks, rehearsals into sessions, sessions into songs. And when the Jackson 5's first single hit the radio, "I Want You Back," the world listened. From Gary to Los Angeles, from New York to London, people heard a sound that was fresh, joyful, alive. And at the center of it was that same 6-year-old boy, now a star, his voice cutting through airwaves like light. Crowds screamed his name. Reporters called him a prodigy. Magazine covers declared, "The Jackson 5. Take over America." But amid the noise and success, there was something else growing inside Michael. Something quieter, more complex. He missed home. He missed being just a boy. Between shows and studio sessions, he'd sometimes sit alone, clutching a small notebook where he scribbled ideas, lyrics, thoughts, pieces of feelings he didn't know how to say aloud. He was learning fast that fame was beautiful and lonely. Joe didn't slow down. "This is it," he kept saying. "This is what we worked for." And it was true. But for Michael, the dream felt different now. It wasn't about proving something anymore. It wasn't even about making his father proud. It was about the connection, that invisible thread between him and the audience, between pain and melody, between fear and expression. That thread was what made him feel alive. One night, after a concert, as the crowd's cheers faded, Michael stood alone backstage, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He saw the lights, the costumes, the fame, and beneath it, the boy who had once needed his mother's eyes to find courage. He smiled softly. "I didn't freeze this time," he whispered. But as he turned away, a shadow crossed his face, the first hint of the loneliness that would follow him for years. Still, that night, he stepped back on stage for the encore, singing his heart out, as if the entire world depended on it. Because in his mind, it did. Catherine, sitting in the front row, watched her son with tears in her eyes. She knew that no matter how bright he shone, there would always be a part of him that was still that small boy. Scared, brave, and pure. And in that moment, she realized something. The world hadn't just gained a star, It had gained a soul, one that would change music, and maybe even hearts, forever. As the curtain fell and the applause roared, Michael turned one last time toward the crowd. He didn't see faces. He saw energy, love, and the same feeling he'd had that night in Gary, when his mother's silent smile gave him strength. That moment, that feeling, it never left him, because it wasn't just a memory. It was his foundation. A boy who once froze on stage had learned to own it, and in doing so, he had unknowingly taken his first step toward becoming a legend. The spotlight faded, but his destiny had just begun. And somewhere, in the quiet of the night, Catherine whispered a prayer, the same one she'd said the night before that first show. God, let the music guide him, and let his heart never forget where it began. The next morning, headlines blazed across America. A star is born. The Jackson 5. Take the world by storm. But for Michael, it was never about headlines. It was about a promise, one that began with fear, and a mother's faith that turned silence into song. And even though the world didn't know it yet, that 6-year-old boy from Gary, Indiana, was about to change the sound of forever. Fame came faster than anyone could prepare for. One day, Michael was a boy running barefoot through the streets of Gary, Indiana. The next, he was the face of Motown, the voice that could stop hearts and move crowds. He should have been happy. He was adored, celebrated, crowned a prodigy. But behind that curtain of applause, something heavier began to grow. Fame, for a child, is a strange thing. It gives before it takes. It fills your world with light, then blinds you with it. Michael loved to sing, to dance, to perform. But now it wasn't just joy. It was responsibility. Millions expected him to be perfect every night, every song, every smile. And Joe made sure of it. Again, his father would say during rehearsals. Michael would try, tired but obedient. Again, Joe repeated until his voice hardened like iron. The room would fall silent except for the echo of music and the sound of effort. If a note cracked, Joe's eyes would narrow. If Michael missed a beat, the tension would thicken like smoke. Michael learned something then, that perfection had a price, and it was always higher than anyone could afford. He never talked back. He never quit, because deep down he still heard that voice from years ago, his mother's voice. You don't have to be perfect, baby. Just sing from your heart. He held on to that memory like it was oxygen. But even a heart can tire. After long tours, Michael would return to his hotel room and sit in silence. Sometimes he'd press his hand against the glass window and stare out at the fans screaming below. They loved Michael Jackson, the performer, but few saw Michael, the boy who just wanted to go home, take off his shoes, and sit in the grass. He once told his brothers, "I feel like I'm watching my own life from far away." They didn't understand. Not yet. Every time he stepped on stage, the crowd erupted. Every time he sang, people wept with joy. And yet after the music stopped, he'd feel something missing, something empty. The same stage that once gave him courage had now become a cage. One night after a show, he sat alone backstage, still dressed in his sparkling outfit. His mother walked in quietly, her eyes full of love and worry. "You all right, Michael?" she asked. He looked up, tears shining under the stage lights. "I don't know if I can do this forever, Mom." She knelt beside him. "Do what, baby?" "Be perfect. Make everyone happy. I love the music, but sometimes I wish I could just sing without everyone watching." Her hand found his. "You can't control what the world expects of you, but you can control what's inside you. You sing because it's who you are. That's the part no one can take." Michael nodded, but the words only half settled, because he was beginning to realize something painful, that his gift, the one that had lifted him from fear to fame, was also becoming the thing that kept him from being free. As the lights dimmed and the world slept, Michael lay awake, haunted by a thought that wouldn't leave him. If I stop singing, who am I? The same boy who once froze on stage now stood at the top of the world. But for the first time he feared he might be losing himself. That fear, quiet, invisible, would follow him for the rest of his life. And though he didn't know it then, It was already shaping the man he'd become, because even legends, even icons carry the ghosts of their beginnings. And Michael's ghost was a 6-year-old boy, standing frozen in a spotlight, learning what it means to turn fear into fire. The world called him a superstar, Motown's golden child, the future of music. But for Michael, every new success came with a whisper in the back of his mind. Don't let them down. He was only a teenager, but he carried the weight of expectations heavier than most grown men ever would. Crowds filled arenas. Television shows begged for appearances. Everywhere he went, the world screamed his name. But behind the cheers, behind the blinding lights and glittering costumes, was a boy still trying to understand the meaning of it all. Michael started noticing things. The way adults looked at him like he was a product, not a person. The way schedules were planned down to the minute. The way his life was no longer his own. Joe saw only forward, more records, more tours, more success. But Catherine saw something else. The quiet fatigue in her son's eyes, the slow dimming of his laughter. One night, as the family celebrated another hit single, Michael slipped away to the backyard. The stars above seemed far away, almost unreachable. He looked up at them and whispered, "Do they ever get tired of shining?" His mother's voice came from behind him. "Even stars need rest, baby." He turned and smiled weakly. "But what if they fall when they stop?" Catherine looked at him for a long time before answering. "Then they light up another sky." Her words stayed with him, even years later when fame became both his crown and his cross. The Jackson 5 were unstoppable. Everywhere they went, cameras followed. And yet Michael's heart began to long for something simpler, something real. He started writing songs that no one had asked him to write. Songs about innocence, loneliness, love, and loss. He poured into music what he couldn't say in words, because inside him, the child who once froze on stage was still there, vulnerable, wide-eyed, yearning for connection. One evening, after a long rehearsal, Joe caught him sitting in a corner, scribbling lyrics instead of resting. "What's that?" Joe asked. "Just a song," Michael said softly. Joe frowned. "You don't need to write. We've got people for that." But Michael didn't stop. Because for him, writing wasn't about work. It was about survival. He needed music the way most people need air. And while Joe pushed for perfection, Michael began reaching for something deeper. Truth. He didn't want to just perform. He wanted to express. In every note he sang, there was still that echo. That moment when his mother's smile brought him back from fear. That connection between love and courage. Between vulnerability and strength. Years later, when he looked back on his life, he would say, "It all started with that night. I froze. And my mother's love unfroze me." He understood then that greatness wasn't about being perfect. It was about being human. About turning pain into something that could touch others. But the world wasn't built to let him be human. It only wanted the magic, and so the crown grew heavier. The crowds got louder. The expectations became impossible. The spotlight that once saved him now burned hotter than ever. Yet through it all, Michael carried his mother's words like a hidden melody in his heart. "You don't have to be perfect. Just sing from your heart." And he did. Even when his heart broke, even when the world misunderstood him, even when the weight of his gift became too much to bear. Because deep down he knew. The boy from Gary was still singing. Still reaching for that light that first shone on him when he was 6 years old. A light that had once terrified him, but ultimately transformed him. By the time he was a man, that moment had become legend. A story whispered in interviews, remembered in quiet moments. The night Michael Jackson froze on stage. The night his mother's silent smile awakened something the world would never forget. It was more than courage, more than talent. It was the birth of a purpose. The world saw a performer. But behind the fame was still a son, carrying his mother's love like armor, her faith like fuel. Because sometimes it only takes 10 seconds to change a life. 10 seconds to turn fear into forever. 10 seconds to create a sound that could heal hearts around the world. And for Michael, those 10 seconds became the foundation of everything. He would go on to redefine music, break barriers and inspire generations. But no matter how high he climbed, he never forgot that first moment, the silence, the fear, and the smile that set him free. It was the moment a boy became an artist, and an artist became immortal. As the curtain closed on another concert years later, Michael stood backstage, sweat glistening, the roar of thousands fading into a hum. He closed his eyes and whispered a quiet prayer. "Thank you, Mom, for believing in me." Because in his heart, he knew. She hadn't just changed one performance. She had changed the course of music itself. And somewhere, beyond the lights, beyond the applause, the spirit of that moment still lived. In every song, every beat, every heart that ever felt the magic of Michael Jackson. The crown may have been heavy, but the love that gave it to him made it eternal. Years passed. The boy who once trembled under the stage lights had become the brightest light in the world. Michael Jackson, a name that echoed across continents, through generations, through hearts. He had done what no one else ever had. He broke barriers, crossed boundaries, and united millions through sound. Every step, every note, every beat, perfection. But behind that perfection lived the same little boy who once froze, the same heart that once feared the crowd, the same soul that had been set free by a mother's smile. Even in his greatest moments, Thriller, Billie Jean, Beat It, he never forgot that feeling of standing small before something enormous. Because in truth, Michael never performed for the world. He performed to feel alive. He often said, "When I'm on stage, I'm safe. That's where I belong." But few knew why. It was because that stage, the same one that had once terrified him, had become his sanctuary, the only place where fear turned to fire and silence turned to song. But with every show, every roar of the crowd, came an invisible shadow, the weight of being Michael Jackson. He couldn't walk the streets. He couldn't live freely. And sometimes, when the applause faded and the world went quiet, he'd sit alone, remembering the boy who just wanted to sing from his heart. One night, years later, before a concert in London, he spoke softly to a close friend. He said, "Sometimes I still hear my mom's voice before I go on stage. I still feel that same fear I did when I was little. But when I remember her face, it disappears." His friend asked him, "Even after all these years?" Michael smiled faintly, "Especially after all these years." It was as if that one childhood moment had frozen in time, a sacred memory he returned to whenever the world became too loud. Because that's what anchors a soul like his. Not fame, not power, not applause, but love. Pure, unconditional love. The kind that reaches into fear and says, "You can do this." And so every time Michael performed, he wasn't just entertaining. He was reliving that 10-second miracle. Over and over again. Every song, a thank you. Every dance, a prayer. Every heartbeat, a memory of the mother who had taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the power to rise above it. As his career reached unimaginable heights, Michael's performances began to take on something more spiritual, almost otherworldly. It wasn't just music anymore. It was transformation, pain becoming beauty, fear becoming freedom, humanity becoming art. But in private, Michael often said something haunting. He'd whisper, "I still feel like that little boy," not in weakness, but in wonder, because despite the fame, the pressure, the myths that surrounded him, he never let go of that childlike soul. And maybe that's why the world loved him. Because he reminded everyone, no matter who you are or how high you climb, you are still that child inside, reaching for courage, reaching for light. In his final years, Michael often spoke of peace, of wanting to give back, to heal the world, to spread the same love that had once saved him. He told his mother one evening, "Mom, I want to make people feel safe, the way you made me feel that night." And she, older now, smiled softly. "You already have, Michael. Every time you sing." It was true. From that one trembling moment on a small stage, Michael's life had become a song, one that healed millions. A song born from fear, carried by faith, and completed by love. He had turned a childhood freeze into the rhythm of a lifetime. He had transformed 10 seconds of silence into a legacy that would never end. And when the final curtain eventually fell, when the lights dimmed and the world went quiet once more, his voice didn't fade, because it had never been just his. It belonged to everyone who ever felt afraid to step into their own spotlight. Michael once said, "To live is to be musical, starting with the blood dancing in your veins. Everything living has rhythm." Maybe that's what his mother saw that day. Not just a frightened boy, but a soul born to move the world. A rhythm too powerful to stop, even by fear. So when history remembers Michael Jackson, it remembers the king of pop, the perfection, the performance, the genius. But behind all that was a moment so simple, so human, it redefined everything that followed. A 6-year-old boy froze on stage. His mother smiled, and in that instant, the greatest performer in history was born. The music never stopped after that. It just kept echoing, through time, through hearts, through generations, because sometimes all it takes to change the world is 10 seconds of love.